All right, welcome back, Econ students. This is Unit 4, and we're moving into Chapter 13, talking about business cycles and economic instability. We're going to look specifically at price indexes and business cycles, but before we do, we would normally do a little bit of research, right? We spent a bunch of time in Chapter 12 talking about gross domestic product, and we talked about Mr. Clem rambling on saying that consumption was 60 to 70% of our GDP, and that investment was 10 to 20% of our GDP, and government was 10 to 20%, and looking at net exports. And part of that was, how did I make up those numbers, right? Or did I make up those numbers, or how did I come up with those numbers? And then we would do a research project on where was our economy the highest as far as a percentage of consumption or investment or government spending. And we would have picked a decade and had you gone and done that research. So I'm going to give you a little preview of what we should have done and kind of how and why I came up with those numbers. And it's not just Mr. Clem making stuff up. In our I have a college macro textbook that had all these numbers, and this is where we base all that research. And it would start with gross domestic product here from 1929, and it wouldn't give every year, but it kind of go every couple years all the way up to 2009, right? So not quite 100 years worth of information. And we'd start with GDP in the U.S. economy was $103 billion. Personal consumption expenditures was 77 of that. Business investment was 16.5 billion. Government was 9 billion, and the net exports was a positive, 0.4 or $400 million. So if we took the actual number, divided it by GDP, as a percent of GDP, consumption was 74.7%. And if we look just at consumption, Great Depression, it got really high, right? Tail end of the Great Depression, it was like 80% of our economy. But kind of scrolling through, pretty standard 65 to 70%, with the exception of 1942 to 1944. And for those who were remembering, that was WW2, right? And that's where we had massive government projects spending money for the war effort, hence why, government part of GDP was such a large percentage in that time frame. And those are outliers. Those are not normal times. But if we look at all of our other years from 1929 to 2009, we're pretty solid as a percentage of GDP, middle 60s to kind of 70% of our GDP. And then I, being the math dork I am, I averaged it out, and the average over all those numbers was about 67%. We crunch the numbers on, our blue color here, personal consumption expenditures, just did that. Green is going to be our business investment. Right? Buying businesses, buying inventory, machines, tools, so on and so forth. Not a lot of business spending at all during the Great Depression, which kind of makes sense. Not a lot of it during the WW2 timeframe. But you take those two very distinct economic events out, and we're 14s, 16s, 13s, 15s, 17s, 15s. We average almost 15%. And again, this is like 2009, $14 trillion worth of GDP. 1.6 trillion was business investment. Those are huge numbers, right? But if we look at it over, what's the percentage? The numbers I'm pointing out, kind of that 10 to 20% are not out of line. One of the reasons why I do this is, government spending. And we look at, boy, our government's spending a lot of money. And yes, they are. They are spending a lot of money. And outside of World War II, we have been spending 15 to 20% as a portion of our GDP on government spending forever, right? This isn't just a recent thing. This isn't just the last couple administrations. We've been 20% all through the 2000s, even when economic times were really good, right? We've been spending about 20% through the 90s, in 1990, 91, when I was your age in high school, the economy was struggling a little bit. We go back to, we don't have numbers for the 70s. That would have been interesting to look at. But even here, 1952, 1953, kind of the golden age of the U.S. economy, it's still a solid 22, 23%, right? It's not just a new thing. So as we look back, how did I come up with those numbers? That was the research we would do after the fact. So let's move on with business cycles. We have 4 parts to a business cycle. We got the ups, the downs, the very top end, and the very bottom end. So most economies have some upswing, some downswing, some upswing, some downswing. Let's talk about the upswing. The upswing here is expansion. That's where real GDP, again, GDP adjusted for inflation, is increasing. Right? From year to year, you're seeing that number grow, and not just grow because of inflation. We start looking at some of the downturns, which I would argue right now, spring of 2020, we were in the downturn. To be considered a recession, you need at least 2 quarters or 6 consecutive months of declining real GDP. Right? Our economy has been working down or shrinking, if you will, for a couple of months now. I would say we got to wait till, January we were still doing fine, but I'd say February is when things started to slow down. So we got February, March, April, we're May 1 right now. We still probably got to wait till June, end of June, maybe July, to officially call this a recession. Right? It sure looks like it's going to be that way. We're going to see real GDP going down. We're going to see unemployment going up. But you need 6 straight months to technically call it a recession. Our last 2, our trough and our peak, they're tough to judge until you've already passed them, right? If you look at the trough, and again, that's going to be down here where you kind of at your worst or your lowest, if you will. Well, you're not really going to know where you're at your lowest until things start to, trend upwards, right? As things start going in a positive direction, oh yeah, that's where we were at our worst. Or you look at, say, your peak, our peak is back over here. Well, how do we know when the peak was? Well, once we've already started to see GDP slow down, that's when we know, oh yeah, back in, winter of 2019, that was the peak for this chunk of our business cycle. Right? And then as we got into early 2020, we started seeing recession. When we talk about the Great Depression, we're talking 1929 to, again, it's argued probably 1934 is about the time we got out of the Great Depression. That was several years. And what we had was real GDP going down for an extended period of time, hence they called it a depression. I don't know if there's an official, it's got to be this many months of GDP going down. It's got to be this certain percentage of unemployment to call it a depression. I don't think there's an official textbook definition. We look at this chunk of time, this late 1920s, early 1930s, and saw 1 out of every 4 people out of work for an extended period of time. We're like, well, that's the worst we've seen in modern times. So we're going to call that a depression as kind of a measuring stick. What were some of the reasons for that? There was a pretty large gap between the haves and the have-nots, so a disparity in income. We had easy and plentiful credit. We had people overextending themselves, borrowing more than they could really afford to pay back because they were super optimistic, thinking, hey, everything's going to be just fine going forward. I don't mind borrowing more. We saw some global economic conditions create some of that slowdown. We saw some banking issues. We'll eventually talk about banking. And back in this time, there was no FDIC, there was no SEC, right? There were no financial police, if you will, to kind of help guard against people making choices or banks, making maybe poor choices with your money. And probably the last one I would say was a shrinking of the money supply. Right? If the money supply would have continued to stay constant or grow, there'd have been credit for people to borrow and spend. When that money supply started to shrink, there was less money to even get the engine going. Now we look at the most recent time where we could call something a recession, and this is what was called the Great Recession. This was 2007 to 2009. We're talking probably 18 months of declining real GDP. We have 15% unemployment. This was primarily created, again, by easy and plentiful credit, people getting overextended. Subprime lending was part of it. The mortgage meltdown was part of it. Tail end of 1990s into 2000, the stock market was going gangbusters, and it was kind of the dawn of the internet age, and it's often called the dot-com bubble, right? And anything that had to deal with internet or internet-type companies was just making money hand over fist. And this is pre-Facebook, pre-Twitter, pre-Snapchat and TikTok and all of that kind of stuff, right? This is the people thinking up those ideas. So all of a sudden, some guy says, "Hey, I got this new, thing where people can share pictures and anybody can look at anybody's pictures. You don't have to email them. Facebook's what I'm referring to. This is a pretty unique, revolutionary idea. Let's start making that up, right? Let's start making up, networks and Zoom and all of this kind of stuff." Well, as that started to slow down a little bit, people took their money and said, "Hey, I want to go invest in something, maybe something a little bit more safe than the stock market." So they started investing in property and businesses and flipping houses. And we got into a situation where people, again, were getting overextended. People were borrowing money to buy homes because they were seeing the value of homes going up tremendously. But people would borrow, maybe refinance. They'd borrow, buy a home, see the equity in the home grow, and then say, "You know what, I want to turn and burn and buy a bigger home." Right? So your $200,000 house you trade in for the $400,000 house. And that was all fine and good, assuming that the equity in the homes kept going up, the wealth effect, and or your paycheck was there. Well, when things started slowing down, people couldn't afford these mortgages, and they started bailing on them. You had some bank failures and, unfortunately, some government bailout, which creates the idea of something called moral hazard. We had some very complex investment options. If we were in class, we'd maybe take some time and look at what these are. We'll probably touch on them a little bit in chapter 16. And again, our credit markets were frozen. People really weren't borrowing a lot of money. Thinking in the Keynesian viewpoint, the government stepped in and provided some stimulus and some bailout packages for some very big businesses to make sure they were not going to fail. And if you were thinking more along the classical lines of economics or your Friedman, they would have said, "You know what, just let it be. Let those who made poor choices fail." The Keynesian viewpoint said, well, in the absence of consumption by people, in the absence of business investment, government use should maybe stick in and kind of try and level out the recession and try and get us back on expansionary times. What are the causes of the ups and downs in a business cycle? Well, the biggest one here is going to be capital expenditures. Now, this would be durable goods for us as individuals. It would be capital goods for businesses, right? Buying those big ticket items. If you were to look at kind of the ups and downs of the business cycle and look at where businesses are spending money, as times are getting better, you see businesses spending just boatloads of money trying to stay ahead of that curve. Well, and then as things start to slow down, you see them drastically cutting. So our blue line's the business cycle, and our red line is kind of the reaction of business investment. Right? And right now, we're kind of taking this downturn, if you will, here. This also applies to inventory adjustments. Again, from a business standpoint, right? Things are going good. You're trying to buy in bulk. You're trying to keep ahead of your customers. Nothing worse than somebody coming to your store and you don't have what they want. You know, they get disgruntled. They're not coming back. You're spending that money to buy whatever it is you're trying to buy, and then all of a sudden you start looking at it piling up. And you're like, oh, crap. People are starting to be pessimistic. The economy's starting to slow down, yet I still have all of these inventories and resources that I've been acquiring. I better start cutting it off here pretty quick because it's piling up and not flying off the door. We can look at innovation and imitation. Again, from the business standpoint, technology improvements can have some big swings in our business cycle. We look at monetary factors such as interest rates, which the government has an effect on. I don't want to say control over, but they also have an effect or control over government spending. And then we have external shocks, right? And that's going to affect everybody. You know, this coronavirus is affecting everybody, right? It's affecting companies, it's affecting governments, it's affecting consumption from people. Great Recession was an external shock, .com, 9/11 external shocks, WW2 external shocks. But all of these are reasons why the business cycle has some ups and downs and why the business cycle isn't just a nice flat linear line. One of our next ideas is we're going to talk about inflation, and inflation is the overall general rise in prices from one year to the next. It's one of the reasons why Keynesian economists want to kind of put their hand on the thermostat and turn up and turn down the heat on the economy. Part of it is to deal with business cycles, right? The ups and the downs, right? As the recession type situation comes, consumers not spending, businesses not spending, they may choose to turn up the heat to try and have government spend more and try and get the economy going again. They may look at the economy going too well, right? They start seeing kind of this uptrend on the economy and they see prices going up. They're like, ooh, that might be that could be detrimental to what we're doing. Let's maybe turn down the thermostat on the economy. Well, they got to be able to measure it first before they can have the turn it up, turn it down. How do they do that? It's through a couple different ways. One is the consumer price index. And if you want to put it in plain old Mr. Clem terms, it's almost as if you grab a shopping cart and you have a list of over 1,000 different items you're going to go buy. And you go to the grocery stores and you go buy all 1,000 of these items and you add up the price of it at the end. And you do that on a monthly basis. Once you've done and you've added up your total shopping cart worth of goods, you're going to compare it to a base year. And often we're using 1982 to 1984 as that base year. So you have your, market baskets of goods here compared to our base year market basket of goods. And if all we did was just compare it to 82, 84, we'd see a big number. But we would say, well, what were those baskets of goods in 2019 quarter one? Well, what were they in 2019 quarter two? Like the January, February, March, April, May, June. What were they in quarter three? Right? And you can kind of get a trend is, are prices going up or are they kind of holding steady or going down? So the consumer part of the consumer price index is looking just that way at the consumption side. We also have something called a producer price index, and it's doing very similar things, except it's looking at the change in cost of the raw materials, the stuff that's going into the products that companies are making. So again, it's almost like they got a shopping cart, but they're buying even more. Maybe they're buying 10,000 items, but their items are cotton and grain and lumber and, 2x4s and petroleum and all of, services, all the, cost of a tax return, cost of a haircut, whatever it is, right? The raw material stuff. And again, they're comparing it to 82, 84. Consumer price index is like the final actual selling price for these goods that you'd buy in an actual store. So both of these will add up the shopping cart worth of goods and then compare it to that same shopping cart back in 1982, 1984 to say what's happening to prices. On average, they're going to go up about, whoops, I can write that cleaner than that. They're going to go up about 2 to 3%, roughly. You'll often hear people talk about a cost of living adjustment, right? General rise in prices. Prices in general go up in that 1 to 2, 2 to 3% range. That's normal. If it starts getting beyond that 2% range, that's when economists start to worry. If it gets down to where prices are holding steady, you may have something called stagflation, or inflation that is actually going backwards, right? Things are getting cheaper. You say, sweet, things are getting cheaper. Well, yes, but also if things are getting cheaper, then wages are probably going down as well. So the idea of business cycles, the ups and downs in the economy, defining what part of the up and down are we on, talking about what is causing that up and down, talking about consumer price index and this idea of producer price index.